Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of PodBites, where we break down complex medical topics into bite sized pieces. I'm your host, Jude Jamjoom, and today we're going to explore a fascinating and very high yield topic in hematology hemoglobinopathies. And joining me today is Nour Alfarra, who will help us bring these cases and concepts to life.
Hello, Jude, and hello to all our amazing listeners. I'm really excited for this episode. We're about to dive into some of the most essential concepts in hematology, including the morphology, genetic, and molecular mechanisms that define disorders like thalassemia and sickle cell disease.
Before we deep dive into our topic, let's start with the foundation, the structure of hemoglobin itself, its different globin chains, where they come from, and how they change throughout life. Because before we can understand any hemoglobinopathy, we need to know what the normal looks like.
Think of hemoglobin as a four-seater car. Each seat is a globin chain, and each passenger carries a heme group with oxygen. In adults, the model we drive around with is hemoglobin A, 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. The alpha chain is composed of 141 amino acids, while the beta chain is composed of 146 amino acids.
Nice analogy. And where are these globin genes actually located?
The alpha globin gene sits on chromosome 16, 2 on each chromosome, so 4 in total. Meanwhile, the beta-like gene cluster, which includes beta, gamma, delta, and epsilon, hangs out on chromosome 11.
So it's literally like a coordinated team. 2 chromosomes, multiple globins, all syncing to make oxygen delivery work. But I remember something about these types changing as we grow up, right?
Exactly. There's a whole globin switch timeline through life. In the embryo, you have zeta and epsilon. These chains form embryonic hemoglobins, Gower1, Gower2, and Portland. In the fetus, it switches to alpha and gamma chains, creating hemoglobin fetal. That's the famous fetal hemoglobin. And by around 6 months after birth, the gamma chains step aside and beta chains take over, forming an adult hemoglobin A.
So that explains why newborns with sickle cell or thalassemia look totally fine at first. That's because the red blood cells are still packed with fetal hemoglobin.
Exactly. Once the switch to beta chains happens, that's when the pathology begins to show. And sometimes when 2 different beta gene mutations come from each parent, we get what's called compound heterozygosity, the in-between forms like thalassemia intermedia.
Now that we've got our foundation built, let's talk about when to even suspect something's wrong with hemoglobin in the first place.
We need your attention, listeners. There are a few red flag scenarios that should ring alarm bells. First, cyanosis with normal partial pressure of oxygen. That's when oxygen's fine, but hemoglobin itself is off, like in methemoglobinemia. Second, cyanosis without heart or lung diseases. Third, erythrocytosis with normal or high erythropoietin. That is when the body is trying to compensate for abnormal hemoglobin. Fourth, any unexplained hemolytic anemia. And finally, if there is family history or abnormal premarital screening showing an odd hemoglobin band.
So basically, if it's not iron, not B12, not folate, and the story just doesn't add up, start thinking about hemoglobinopathies.
Exactly. That's your cue to pull out the smear, electrophoresis, and maybe even molecular tools.
Speaking of tools, most of us stop at electrophoresis, but there's actually a whole lab arsenal behind hemoglobin analysis. Let's unpack that next.
Absolutely. When the basics don't give you the full picture, here's what else can help. The oxygen equilibrium curve shows whether a variant holds onto oxygen too tightly or lets it go too soon. Ultraviolet visible spectroscopy picks up the M hemoglobins and unstable variants. Heat and isopropanol stability tests reveal unstable hemoglobins. DNA sequencing or mass spectrometry identify rare mutations. And lastly, supravital stains help visualize included bodies like Heinz or hemoglobin H.
So it's a bit like detective work. Start with the simple smear, move to electrophoresis, and if the story's still unclear, go molecular.
Exactly. One test at a time, until the culprit shows itself.
Alright, now that we have the basics of hemoglobin all laid out, let's see what happens when the body just doesn't make enough of it. Welcome to the thalassemia family. For our first case, a 24-year-old man comes for premarital screening. He's healthy, but his CBC shows mild microcytic anemia. His MCV is 67 and has target cells on smear. Nour, what are we looking at?
That profile fits β-Thalassemia minor, the carrier state. It's heterozygous for a beta globin mutation. So one gene underproduces while the other works normally. On electrophoresis, you'll find that signature rise in hemoglobin A2, more than 3.5%.
So the patient's basically fine, just microcytic on paper.
Exactly. The bone marrow still makes plenty of red blood cells, just smaller ones. It's usually found incidentally during screening.
And what's the management?
Mostly genetic counseling. No treatment needed. And please, no iron unless ferritin says so. The real goal is preventing two carriers from having a child with major disease.
Got it. Carrier state, calm patient, big implications for family planning. Okay, Nour, hit us with a practice question.
Are you ready, listeners? Which hemoglobin fraction is elevated in beta-Thalassemia trait? That would be hemoglobin A2.
Alright, that's our gentle introduction, but thalassemia doesn't always stay quiet. Sometimes it gets more dramatic. Let's crank up the severity. Our next case is a 15-year-old boy that presents after a viral infection with jaundice and fatigue. His hemoglobin is 9, his reticulocyte count is 8%, his bilirubin is up, and the lab shows an odd H peak on electrophoresis. The supravital stain reveals a golf ball pattern inside the red blood cells.
That's HbH disease, a form of α-Thalassemia, where 3 alpha genes are deleted. Too few alpha chains means the beta chains clump into β-4 tetramers, which precipitate and make those golf ball inclusions.
So they end up with chronic hemolysis that worsens during stress?
Exactly. Moderate anemia, splenomegaly, and mild jaundice that can flare up with infections or oxidative drugs.
What about the management?
Mostly supportive. Folate, avoid oxidants, and transfuse if severe. Splenectomy can help when crisis keeps coming back.
Alright, alpha chains covered. Now let's go back to the beta side and meet the in-between of the thalassemia spectrum. Here's our next patient, a 20-year-old man with pallor, frontal bossing, and a huge spleen. His hemoglobin is 8, WBCs are 20, his high-performance liquid chromatography shows HbF 88% and HbA 12%.
That's beta-Thalassemia intermedia, sitting between minor and major. He's a compound heterozygote, 1 severe beta 0 and 1 mild beta plus mutation. Fewer beta chains leads to excess alpha chains, leading to precipitation as well as ineffective erythropoiesis and bone marrow expansion.
Hence, the frontal bossing, also called hair-on-end appearance.
Exactly. The bone marrow is working overtime. These patients develop iron overload, both from transfusions and from increased absorption.
So the mainstay is to keep the hemoglobin level steady and control the iron, right?
Yes, regular transfusions to keep hemoglobin 10 or above, plus chelators like desferoxamine, deferiprone, or defersirox. And for a cure, stem cell transplant is our best shot.
Got it. Let's anchor that with a practice question. Which hemoglobin fraction is markedly elevated in beta-thalassemia intermedia? Fetal hemoglobin. All right, Nour, we've seen the carrier, we've seen the in-between. Now let's meet the severe end of the spectrum. A 1-year-old child is brought in for pallor, irritability, poor feeding, and failure to thrive. The mother says the baby was completely normal until around 6 months. But now, he has a big belly, looks pale, and gets tired quickly. The CBC shows his hemoglobin is 5, MCV is 60, and electrophoresis reveals almost no hemoglobin A, with hemoglobin F making up the majority. Nour, what are we looking at?
This is a classic beta-Thalassemia major, also known as Cooley's anemia. Both beta-globin genes are severely mutated. We have 2 beta zeros, so the child essentially cannot produce beta chains at all, meaning no hemoglobin A. At birth, they look fine because hemoglobin fetal is still dominant. But around 6 months, when the gamma switches to beta, everything falls apart.
That explains why symptoms hit right after infancy. It's all about timing.
Exactly. Without beta chains, the alpha chains accumulate and precipitate inside RBC precursors, causing massive ineffective erythropoiesis. The bone marrow expands like crazy, trying to compensate. This leads to frontal bossing, maxillary enlargement, hair-on-end skull on X-ray, and hepatosplenomegaly from extramedullary hematopoiesis.
Okay, so this is the classic picture everyone associates with severe thalassemia.
Yes, and without treatment, these children become profoundly anemic and develop high-output heart failure. They also absorb iron excessively through the gut. And on top of that, regular transfusions bring even more iron, leading to iron overload.
So these patients end up depending on transfusion for survival?
Absolutely. They require lifelong regular transfusions every 2 to 4 weeks to keep hemoglobin 9 to 10 or above and support normal growth and development. But because of iron overload, they also need iron chelation therapy, as mentioned before, desferoxamine, deferiprone, or deferasirox.
And for cure?
Currently, the only curative option is stem cell transplantation, ideally early in life. Gene therapy is emerging but still developing.
Let's lock this in with a quick question. What's the hallmark electrophoresis finding in beta-Thalassemia major?
Almost no hemoglobin A and markedly elevated hemoglobin F.
Perfect. Severe anemia after the 6-month mark, bone changes, transfusion dependence, and dominant HbF on electrophoresis. That's beta-Thalassemia major in a nutshell.
So we've seen how thalassemias can range from barely noticeable to completely life-altering. Before we move on, let's tackle the two most high-yield mix-ups: why thalassemia isn't iron deficiency, and how to tell intermedia from major.
The microcytic picture confuses students all the time. You see low MCV and right away everyone says iron deficiency. But sometimes it's not the iron at all. It's thalassemia trait pretending to be iron deficiency. How can we tell them apart?
You're right. They look almost identical under the microscope. But the story behind them couldn't be more different. In iron deficiency anemia, the problem is simple. You've run out of the building material. There isn't enough iron to make heme, so the bone marrow tries to keep up but ends up producing smaller and paler cells. In thalassemia, though, iron isn't the issue. The body has plenty of it, but the blueprint is faulty. The genes making globin chains aren't doing their job properly. So even though there is enough iron, the factory is producing defective hemoglobin and lots of it.
So both are microcytic but for totally different reasons. One's missing the supplies and the other's missing the instructions.
Exactly. And that's why their labs behave oppositely. In iron deficiency, production slows. There are fewer red cells overall, ferritin is low, and everything improves when you give iron. In thalassemia trait, the bone marrow doesn't slow down. It's overactive. You actually get a normal or high red cell count because it's producing tons of tiny red cells that don't work well. And giving iron, that does absolutely nothing.
So the simple way to remember it, iron deficiency is like the factory ran out of supplies, and in thalassemia, it's like the factory keeps working, but the parts are defective. Alright, that clears up the microcytic mystery, but among thalassemias themselves, there's another mix-up, intermedia versus major. Let's straighten that out next. Okay, so we know both intermedia and major are beta globin production problems, but how do we draw the line between them?
Think of it like this, Jumi. Intermedia is a partial factory shutdown, while major is a total blackout. In beta-thalassemia intermedia, the body can still make some beta chains, so the anemia is moderate. Patients are pale and have splenomegaly, but can often go months without transfusions. While in beta-thalassemia major, both beta genes are basically dead silent. The baby looks fine at birth because fetal hemoglobin is doing all the work. But once hemoglobin F starts switching to hemoglobin A around 6 months, everything crashes. The child becomes severely anemic, irritable, and their growth stalls.
That's when we start seeing bone changes, right?
Yes, the bone marrow expands like crazy to compensate. You get frontal bossing, maxillary prominence, and the hair on end skull on X-ray. Without transfusions, the spleen and liver enlarge, and iron overload builds up fast.
So the key difference is the transfusion dependence.
Right. Intermedia patients might only need blood occasionally, during illness or stress, but major patients need regular transfusions every few weeks, just to keep hemoglobin above 10. Those transfusions keep them alive, but the price is iron overload, which we manage with iron chelation therapy.
So both are on the same path, just a difference in how severe the mutation hits.
Exactly. And that's why prevention, such as premarital or prenatal screening, is everything. One simple test can prevent an entire lifetime of transfusions.
Thank you, Nour, for that wonderful comparison. Alright, we've covered the thalassemia spectrum from light to severe. How about moving to something a little rarer? A variant that's harmless on its own, but interesting when paired with others. Our next case is a 24-year-old nurse with mild anemia and fatigue. She has heavy menstrual bleeding, but otherwise feels fine. Her hemoglobin is 11, her MCV is 65, her ferritin is normal, and her HbA1c shows hemoglobin A around 50% and hemoglobin D around 47% and hemoglobin A2 around 3%.
That's hemoglobin D Punjab, a benign beta chain variant common in South Asia. It's a single substitution where glutamine replaces glutamic acid at position 121, changing electrophoretic mobility but not oxygen delivery.
So the mild anemia is from the blood loss, not the variant itself?
Exactly. Heterozygous carriers are healthy, but if combined with hemoglobin S or beta-Thalassemia, it can cause symptomatic disease, which is why genetic counseling matters.
Okay, let's lock that one in with a practice question. What's the clinical significance of hemoglobin D Punjab trait? Usually asymptomatic, but may cause disease when co-inherited with HBS or beta-thalassemia. Okay, Nour, the next one is iconic, sickle cell disease. But before the full story, let's start with a simple trait. Our patient is an 18-year-old athlete. He's healthy but complains of painless blood in the urine after long football games in the sun. His CBC is normal. Electrophoresis shows HbA 57% and HbS 38%.
That's sickle cell trait, hemoglobin AS, heterozygous for the mutation, one normal beta globin gene and one sickle gene. He has both hemoglobin A and hemoglobin S. But hemoglobin A dominates, so cells don't sickle under normal conditions.
So he's fine most of the time. What's behind the blood in the urine then?
Good question, Jumi. The renal medulla is hypoxic, acidic, and hypertonic, perfect for sickling. So during dehydration or prolonged exercise, the papillae can infarct, causing painless hematuria.
So benign but not completely innocent. Any other complications?
Rarely, splenic infarction at high altitudes or exercise-related sudden death, but otherwise, carriers live normal lives.
How do we manage them?
Reassurance, hydration, and genetic counseling, because 2 carriers can have a child with full-blown sickle cell disease.
Trait itself is harmless, but 2 traits can make a crisis. Practice question time. Which hemoglobin fractions characterize sickle cell trait? HbA around 60% and HbS around 40%. Alright, that was the preview. Let's move on to the main act. What happens when HbS completely takes over? Our next patient is a 10-year-old girl who's been in and out the hospital for years with painful crises, usually in her limbs and chest. Today, she's back again with severe bone pain, fever, shortness of breath. Her CBC shows hemoglobin 7, WBC is 30, platelets is 500, and electrophoresis shows HbS 91% with no HbA.
This time, this is sickle cell disease, hemoglobin SS. This is the homozygous form. It's caused by a point mutation in the beta hemoglobin gene, where valine replaces glutamic acid at position 6.
Amazing how one tiny substitution can reshape an entire disease.
Exactly. When deoxygenated, hemoglobin S polymerizes into rigid fibers, distorting RBCs into sickle shapes. They hemolyze easily and block small vessels. That's where the pain crisis come from.
Let's list them for our listeners. The famous sickle crisis.
They are 5. 1. Vaso-occlusive crisis, where there is bone or chest pain, often after dehydration or infection. 2. Sequestration crisis, which is sudden pooling of blood in the spleen, common in kids. 3 is aplastic crisis, usually in parvovirus B19 infection, causing bone marrow shutdown. 4 is hemolytic crisis, where we see increased RBC breakdown. 5 and last is acute chest syndrome, sickling in pulmonary vessels causing hypoxia and fever.
And over time, repeated sickling kills the spleen, right?
Yes, repeated infarctions cause functional asplenia, so they can't clear encapsulated bacteria. That's why they need penicillin prophylaxis and vaccines against strep pneumoniae, Neisseria, and H. influenza.
And what about long-term complications?
Here are the complications, Jumi. Avascular necrosis, leg ulcers, priapism, pigment gallstones, stroke, chronic kidney disease, and the list goes on.
So the management must balance the crisis control and long-term prevention.
Exactly. During crisis, we hydrate, we give analgesia, oxygen, and transfusion. For long-term management, hydroxyurea. It raises hemoglobin F, reduces sickling, improves nitric oxide, and WBC adhesion. As for a cure, stem cell transplant remains the gold standard.
That's a lot of disease for one amino acid change.
It really is one substitution that redefined hematology.
Beautifully said. Let's quiz everyone before we move on. What amino acid substitution causes sickle cell disease?
Valine replaces glutamic acid at position 6 of the beta-globin chain.
Perfect. From trait to tragedy, that's the journey of the sickle cell mutation. All right, Nour, time for our lightning recap. I'll quiz you and our listeners on today's key points. When do we see HbA2 above 3.5%?
Above 3.5, that's beta-thalassemia trait.
What about when do we see no HbA with HbS over 90%?
HbS over 90%, that's sickle cell disease.
What about when we see golf ball inclusions?
That's an easy one, hemoglobinopathy disease.
Okay, what about HbF around 88%?
Is it beta-Thalassemia Major?
Wait, Ishbik, no, it's beta-Thalassemia Intermedia.
Oops.
Okay, last one. When do we see HBD around 47% with normal ferritin?
That's hemoglobin deepened job trait.
Great job, Nour, and hopefully our listeners nailed it too. So today we started with the simple structure of hemoglobin, ended with molecular hemoglobinopathies that shape so many of our clinical cases. It's amazing how a few amino acids or gene deletions can change the entire life of an RBC and the entire story of a patient.
Each red cell abnormality tells a genetic or biochemical story, and recognizing these early can change a patient's entire outcome.
Thank you for joining us on PodBites, where medicine meets clarity. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning, one bite at a time.